I just wanted to start by thanking the organizers. It has been such a fantastic conference with so many interesting papers and so much amazing photographic work. So I have loved every moment of it until now, I think. So yes, let me start. Well, this paper draws on the research done for a photography exhibition, which was presented in 2013 as part of the celebration of the 100th anniversary of suffrage for women in Norway. In my country, women professionals, among them a considerable number of female photographers, made up the core of the organized movement. My paper will draw attention to one of these women, the so far relatively unknown Solveig Lund, who was a professional photographer with her own studio in Oslo, which was then called Christiania. I should perhaps also mention that I'm working on a book on these early women Norwegian photographers. We meet the chosen one for this paper, Solveig Lund, at close range in a self-portrait from the early years of the 19th century, when she must have been in her late 30s. She's sitting here in a studio, smiling, bent over her photographs with a brush in her hand and a cat in her lap. A large amount of photographic prints mounted on cardboard are spread across her working table. Looking closer, we discover that most of them are images of young women in Norwegian national costumes, wearing the traditional bridal crown. In the portrait's slightly unfocused foreground, we also detect another working station, right here. Obviously, there were more women working around the table in Lund's studio. It's not hard to imagine how the woman photographer, in the company of her assistant and in the daylight from the window, has carried out the time-consuming task of hand-coloring cabinet card photographs. Solveig Lund was, as earlier mentioned, one of the many women photographers who participated in the battle for women's right to vote in Norway. But her photographic work has a subdued, harmonious character which forms an interesting contrast to the sharp political rhetoric of her suffragette environment. The activist community urged Norwegian women towards social responsibility and political participation. Maria Høeg, one of Lund's contemporaries, voiced an important sentiment at a 1901 women meeting. Society, she said, is not something that takes place elsewhere, but something of which we are part. All that concerns this society, directly or indirectly, concerns each of its members, the women as much as the man. Høeg, as you see here, was, like Solveig Lund, photographer by profession. And it has often been claimed that photography, by opening up for independent incomes, has been instrumental in women's fight for political equality. As argued by the Swedish art historian Lena Johannesson, women's role as photographers and actors behind, in contrast to in front of the camera, is a dramatic, emancipatory, but little-known story. It is therefore important to call attention to the works of Lund and her contemporaries. Photography was, after all, the medium through which they chose to speak. But what characterized their photographic speech? Is it possible to find lines of connection between their political agenda and their photographic work? And how can we today use Solveig Lund's photographs as tools for historical reflection, or, to use Elizabeth Edwards' expression, as images to think with? The photo archive at the Norwegian Folk Museum showcases the most consequential sampling of Solveig Lund's work, a collection of glass plate negatives. Most of these images are representations of women. Some represent modern women dressed in modern clothing, engaged in modern bourgeois activities, such as skiing was at the time. But the majority of Lund's images are of women are typologizing or allegorical in character, evoking both the pathos of pre-Raphaelite portraiture and the intensity of the portraits of silent movie heroines. She did, for example, produce a series of organized around themes such as the 4 seasons, the month of the year, or European nations. The Nordic skiing beauty that we saw in the last image would, for example, in another photograph be October, elaborately adorned with autumn leaves in her hair and clothing, and in the third image, exquisitely staged as England. She was, however, far from being the only beautiful young woman that posed in front of Lund's camera, something that becomes clear when we move on to the dominant theme in Solveig Lund's production, her series of photographs of women in national costumes. These typologically organized series form, roughly speaking, in 2 categories. The first of these are studio portraits, and the second, portraits for photographs in situ during Lund's journeys, mainly to the western part of Norway, where I come from, and the spectacular fjord district in Hardanger in particular. Lund obviously approached her costume studio portraiture in the same way as her allegorical work. Softly lit close-ups in frontal, profile or 3/4 profile. She even used the same woman to pose for the different series. The woman who you've seen as impersonated as England is in another woman gazing longingly into an imaginary landscape of fjords and mountains, now carrying the typical Hardanger area costume. Likewise, October reappears as a shy bride wearing the costume from another area of western Norway, but also as a pious girl from Hardanger, totally absorbed in her book of hymns. So Lund represents her Norwegian brides as mysterious, strong and beautiful, childishly pure, sometimes even giggling. Through the photographer's meticulous staging, they all seem to be encapsulated in an aura of fairy tales. Her studio work also reveals how she has attempted to supply the costume typologies with cultural historical anchoring. In some of the images, Lund used simple props for this purpose. In other images, she constructed total environments or illusionary folk-life tableaus by the help of richly detailed backdrops. These studio-based staging of Norwegian peasant culture do, however, appear as stiff and almost strangely formal in tone compared to her on-location photographs of women in national costumes, such as the image of a young girl milking goats in front of the weather-beaten walls of a timbered farm building. Here, the photographs small, almost unnoticeable details, such as the girl's unruly hair, hastily folded sleeves, stained skirt, and worn shoes, contribute to making us believe that this girl once was there, and that it actually is her daily life that is recorded through Lund's camera. In this way, the woman photographer also depicted women in their everyday environments, granting viewers a tender and sometimes comic glimpses into the Norwegian farming culture. But the collection of negatives in the museum does not speak about how these images wandered out into the world, or what Elizabeth Edwards would call their social biography. What Solveig Lund's photographs did. Judging from the many cabinet cards, positives and postcard reproductions of her images that are to be found in private collections. The most exclusive versions are the hand-tinted cabinet format prints. And these are, these are the kind of images that Lund is working on in her studio self-portrait. Some of them are only partly tinted, as the ones you see here. In others, we notice how the coloration of the image has been conducted with striking precision and a high degree of aesthetic sensibility. The most comprehensive circulation of Lund's images did, however, take place through the production of postcards. In the first decades of the 20th century, the exclusive cabinet cards were replaced in the market by the much cheaper mass-produced postcard. As postcards, Lund's photographs could be reproduced by means of modern lithographically based techniques and through a wider spectrum of technical and aesthetic solutions. They could, in other words, be reproduced not only in the black and white version, but careful tinting, but they could also be framed by layers of decorative ornaments, or they could be completely overpainted to the extent that they start looking like paintings or oil prints. The motifs from Lund's glass plates negatives were in this way reproduced in a multitude of variations. So Solveig Lund seems to have developed a clear understanding of the need for her images to stand out in the massively competitive postcard market in the first decade of the 20th century. Her costume photographs come across as professionally executed, color-saturated manifestations of broadly appealing folklorism. Deprived of specificities of time and place, they start looking like fairy tale illustrations. Some of them were enlarged and presented and sold as graphic prints. Others were published in magazines outside Norway as part of the marketing of the North. Here, this is a British magazine who salutes these Nordic women as the strongest and most educated and in the world, only after the British cultivated women, of course. Or the women were used in advertising or different consumer goods. So Lund's photographs appear to have enjoyed an enormously wide circulation. I've also found letters from American poets wanting to marry the girls that she has photographed. Yeah. So today her images, particularly the elaborate cabinet cards, are popular as collector's items. But the woman who created these photographs is still unknown to most people. So who then was Solveig Lund? And is it possible to detect any lines of connection between her life practice and her representational practice? The little that so far has existed of information about her is to be found as a short note in the Norwegian photo archivist Susanne Bonge's pioneering list of early Norwegian photographers published in the 1980s. It reads as follows, and Susanne Bonge was an old lady when she wrote this. Solveig Lund, born in Christiania, daughter of Cornelius Clarin and Nilsine Ottilia Foyn, unmarried, was educated as an art photographer, national costume landscapes, etc., with regard to the tourist traffic. She left behind an endowment for holiday stays for tired housewives and such. So through this little biographical note, which briefly speaks about Solveig Lund's family or educational background, her relationship status and her values, a few contour lines of her character becomes visible. Trained as an art photographer, she apparently lived her life as an unmarried, independent woman. The Spear's biographical note importantly also reveals that she must have been a woman with a strong sense of social responsibility and female solidarity. In addition, she was creative enough to understand and take advantage of the economic potential in the contemporary waves of nationalism in Norway, as well as in the rapidly expanding tourist industry. She received her photography training in Copenhagen in the studio of the authorized photographer Jens Petersen. At this point of time, such a training period didn't last longer than a year. It was, however, not easy to be accepted as a trainee, and so Solveig Lund must have been very lucky, or most likely very well connected. Some years later, in 1892, she established her own photography studio, first in Moss, a small town near Oslo, and later in Kristiania, also Oslo. The Lund family archive contains a series of her self-portraits from the 1890s. Aesthetically, they have a lot in common with the many portraits she produced of women in national costume, but her bourgeois urban appearance also has much in common with the fin de siècle portrait painting of modern Nordic women, such as, for example, those we meet in Edvard Munch's paintings. In the collection of letters that are kept in the family archive, only a few are written by Solveig herself. But in the letters addressed to her, we find a poem by her father. He wrote poems all the time. And here he, on one hand, praises the independence of modern women. He was actually the one that got Henrik Ibsen to come and write for the theater in Kristiania, and he saw to that women could get education and teachers in Norway, and that they could learn to swim. That was for some reason important. But he was very for, you know. He wanted his daughters to be independent, but there was a limit to that, which he states in his poem. He says that he wants their independence, but on the other hand, he warns against the danger of letting it exceed the limit of their natural femininity, which was very much a theme at the time. Likewise, her mother tellingly sent the following concerned note to her daughter after Solveig had decided to establish a studio of her own. If you only had chosen to work as an assistant to a male photographer, you could calmly put your salary in your pocket, and even if small, it would have been gained with it would not have been gained with a nervously beating heart, she writes. Solveig Lund's photographic practice never made her rich, even though she managed to establish a large network for sale of her images, with contacts in Stockholm, Copenhagen, and in the Norwegian America. In a letter she wrote to her sister Dagny, who was also an artist, by the way, she complained about her financial situation. Tired and frustrated, she describes the process of tinting photographs as terribly slow work, watercolors as awful to deal with, and the struggle for existence as harsh and difficult. However, from the letters she and her family left behind, we know that Lund had close relationship with women like herself, who had chosen to live free and independent lives, and who were strongly committed to the work of improving women's condition in Norwegian society. But their freedom was not easily gained. This is something that is also important in relation to the understanding of her work, and particularly her stunning portraits of Norwegian women. In Lund's photographic practice, she was in fact facing the same representational dilemma as the British suffragists were addressing at the time. As noted by Lisa Tickner, they were not fighting for their right to be unwomanly, which was a conception of them that they continuously had to work against. They were instead struggling with the problem of supplying the notion of femininity with a new content and on their own terms. In this process of contestation, the British activists on one hand made use of already established visual convention of genres. They did, for example, activate the delicate representation of women drawn from the visual repertoire of pre-Raphaelite and Art Nouveau artists as guardian angels in their battle for women's right to vote. Furthermore, the allegorical representations of women as law or as justice were presented as arguments of how these institutions or values were to be found on the suffragist side in the conflict. But the suffragette representation also included images of ordinary women in their daily life, in activities that stretch beyond the traditional feminine activities at home and in the circle of family life. Cycling was, for example, considered as a liberating activity for modern emancipated women. These British suffragette representations show interesting similarities with Solveig Lund's work. That applies, for example, to her photographs of modern Norwegian women in their skiing outfits, because that was a very modern thing to do in the bourgeoisie at the time, to be healthy and strong and independent. But also to her photographs of nations, the seasons and the continents as a series of female allegorical character, even if they're not anchored textually in ways that open up for reading them unambiguously as renegotiations of femininity. Even so, the expressive qualities and silent strength of her allegorical portraits opens up for reading them as a tribute to women and to femininity in itself. As allegorical objects, the photographs suggest that women can be strong as nation, but also stunningly beautiful, while displaying her richness in variations as the seasons. The same kind of potentiality for feminist readings are to be found in Solveig Lund's photographs of women in national costume. Even if the genre in itself signals that they should be read as typological representation of the nation or the region, the portraits seem to open up for yet another layer of meaning. They do so by performing a more complex understanding of what the typology Norwegian women may contain, something quite different than the cardboard representations of women that her male colleagues would represent at the time. Solveig Lund instead presented Norwegian women as active, industrious, sporty, flirtatious, here they are, pious and serious, etc. The range of femininities that thus are displayed are broad. But what the women in Lund's costume portraits have in common is that they appear with integrity and strength. Their femininity is modern, it's only their costume that are traditional. Let us finally return to Solveig Lund's self-portrait of an independent woman in her studio. It may precisely be here that we find the most explicit example of her visual negotiation of femininity. For being a professional photographer as a woman was definitely something that still entailed being positioned in the borderlands of femininity at the time when she was active behind the camera. She belonged to the first generation of women with power to define the image, not only of themselves, but also of other women. Nevertheless, she still holds a marginalized position in the history of photography as not being modern enough, to quote Martha Merskin from her study of the position of women artists within German modernism. According to Meskeman, art historians have failed to find the terms to account for how such works made culturally and aesthetically sense. I think that goes for Solveig Lund's images too. So inspired by this, I will conclude that Lund's subdued and sometimes romantically idealizing photographic works seem to make sense if they are regarded as subtle negotiations of the mode of representing women in Scandinavian photography at the threshold of modernism. Thank you.